directly to Muhammad. They didn't welcome his message, and it's held against them ever since. And there are many Muslims who literally believe they're the sons of monkeys and pigs.
But what happened in 1967 and 68 is of utmost importance, not just for Poland, but for the nations of the earth, and really for our generation, the epoch and the season of history that we're living in. The Jewish people recaptured the city of Jerusalem, reclaimed the West Bank, and that's when the, quote, occupation began. After the world was taken back by the Six-Day War, after this most significant military conflict in the Middle East, which really left Israel in a much different place than she was before, having recaptured the Golan Heights, the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and most importantly, the old city of David. Now that that had happened, the world had an opportunity to enter a new season in terms of the question of the Jew.
Then you look at, say, a country like Russia under Stalin and the Soviet Union with its anti-Semitism, whereas Jews were the leadership of the communist revolution, and many of them were atheists, and yet they're hated. And you say, no, it's because Jews control all the money. Well, look in Eastern Europe, the late Middle Ages and centuries following that, they're often the poorest of the poor, and yet they were hated. Whatever explanation you use doesn't work. Well, there always has to be a scapegoat. Well, why are the Jews the ones that are so scapegoated all the time?
In 1967 in Poland, there was an outbreak of student protests. The anthem of it was, "We hate Zionism." In the 20 years that led up to this, the statement was, "We hate Jews." Now that the Jewish people had reclaimed and repatriated their homeland, resettled in Judea and Samaria and Gaza and Haifa and Jerusalem, now that that had happened, there was an element of provocation there. There's a geopolitical reality that wasn't present during the days of the Holocaust. The language shifted.
What's the connection between Christian anti-Semitism and Islamic anti-Semitism and Hitler's anti-Semitism and Stalin's anti-Semitism and Japanese anti-Semitism and Greco-Roman anti-Semitism?
The remaining 30,000 Jews who were living in Poland in the wake of 1967 and 1968 was reduced yet again to a mere 3,000 people. The whole world was now dealing with not just the question of the Jew, but the question of the Jew in light of the question of Jerusalem. And the whole debate was now reframed. Instead of rage against the Jewish people, it was rage against Zionism. Now there was actually a geopolitical context to provide a framework for justice and righteousness, whereby Polish anti-Semites, German anti-Semites, Arab anti-Semites, American anti-Semites could now engage into the whole polemic discourse about the aggression of the Zionist Jews because of the provocation of a nation state that was reclaiming and repatriating ancient land.
You got to ask yourself a question. Why did the prophet Zechariah in the 12th chapter talk about that city being the city of controversy for the whole world, so that all the nations of the world want to attack Jerusalem? Why Jerusalem?
I definitely see a resurgence of anti-Semitism in the days that we're living in, and it scares me.
Anti-Semitism has not gone away. Rather, in a post-World War II world, it's masked in something that's seemingly more acceptable. It's masked in anti-Zionism.
Anti-Semitism in Europe, anti-Semitism in the United States, anti-Semitism on college campuses.
Not for a second do I think that all anti-Zionists are Jew haters or anti-Semites, but all anti-Semites and all Jew haters are anti-Zionist. It's very difficult to discern between the two, and because it's difficult to discern, it allows anti-Semitism inside the anti-Zionist world to grow and to foment.
Anti-Semitism has gone underground. It has camouflaged itself. Post-World War II, we now have two realities that are forming the way that anti-Semitism is expressed. We had the Holocaust. Well, of course, after the Holocaust, it's profoundly distasteful to speak negatively in racist terms against the Jewish people. And then, of course, we have the reestablishment of the State of Israel.
Its principles again challenged by the events in the Middle East, the United Nations Security Council holds a solemn session in which all parties to the dispute have their say. Movietone bringing you the highlights.
Israel is not out to conquer any new territory, but is determined to wipe out the bases in the Sinai wilderness from which murder and death and destruction are launched against her.
So much of the criticism of the modern state of Israel today is rooted in these ancient conspiracy theories that paint Israel as an aggressive imperialistic force that will not stop until they take over the world, beginning with the land they're in now, expanding from the Mediterranean to the Jordan to the Euphrates and ultimately over the earth.
The early 1900s, around 1903, coming out of Russia was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In the document, you have this supposed council of Jewish elders or Jewish leaders conspiring on how to take over the world through economics and through the financial institutions, etc., etc. Henry Ford actually published 500,000, he paid for out of his own pocket the publication of 500,000 copies of it. It's a totally fabricated document that has been made up and used as propaganda against the Jewish people, but he nevertheless saw it as fact, as many people did. By 1933, it was being taught in German schools as a fact. It's not the beginning of propaganda against the Jewish people, but it is the most popular one that we have in modern times.
Dort, wo sich an einem Volkskörper eine Wunde zeigt, setzen sie sich fest und ziehen aus dem zerfallenen Organismus ihre Nahrung. Mit den Krankheiten der Völker machen sie ihre Geschäfte und darum sind sie bestrebt, alle Krankheitszustände zu vertiefen und zu verewigen. So ist es in Polen, so war es in Deutschland. So haben die Juden es in ihrer ganzen Geschichte gemacht. Sie tragen die Jahrtausende alten Züge des ewigen Schmarotzertums im Gesicht. Die Züge des ewigen Juden, der sich durch den Lauf der Zeiten und weltweiten Wanderungen stets gleich geblieben ist. Es gibt keinen Unterschied zwischen diesen Juden in Polen und diesen in Palästina, obwohl Erdteile sie trennen.
Even today on YouTube, you can watch conspiracy theory videos, you can watch all of these things, and at the heart of most of them is this idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, or a Jewish conspiracy to take over the financial institutions, that there is a Jew world order of sorts that is ordering the political decisions of the world. At the Nuremberg trials, there's a top-tier SS general who testified against his superiors, and this is what he had to say about the Jewish people, which I think is incredibly relevant in light of Hitler's perspective on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a fact and as this profound organization of these Jewish Zionists to take over the world. This general testifies something very, very different. He says, "I am the only living witness, but I must say the truth. Contrary to the opinion of the National Socialists that the Jews were a highly organized group, the appalling fact was that they had no organization whatsoever. The mass of the Jewish people were taken completely by surprise. They did not know at all what to do. They had no directives or slogans as to how they should act. This is the greatest lie of anti-Semitism. The Jews are conspiring to dominate the world and that they are so highly organized. In reality, they had no organization of their own at all, not even an information service. If they had had some sort of organization, these people could have been saved by the millions, but instead they were taken completely by surprise. Never before has a people gone as unsuspectingly to its disaster. Nothing was prepared, absolutely nothing."
The reestablishment of the State of Israel has provided anti-Semites with a perfect cover to carry on with their anti-Semitism.
It is at its core probably the most prevalent form and oftentimes the most damaging form of Jew hatred, is that it's saying that people of a particular race with particular distinctives are trying to rule the world in a deceptive and evil way. This kind of a thing at its most base level is ugly and anti-Semitic.
We're not saying that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. That would be silly. However, we look at, for instance, the United Nations. More joint resolutions of condemnation against that one state than every other nation in the world.
When I see a double standard, I know something else is going on.
There is racism in the United Nations, and we should be able to openly acknowledge that.
It's almost like when someone has a grudge against a person, You know, and you say, why are you always so hard on them? Why do you always treat them differently? Well, they long time ago. So there's something else going on.
Hostility towards the Jewish people today is largely, allegedly, anchored in criticism against unjust policies of the Jewish state that was established in 1948. But there's a problem with this theory. We have nearly 2,000 years of history in which the continent of Europe, not only Europe, but mostly Europe, was washed in the blood of the Jews time and time again in a succession of expulsions and exiles and bloodbaths. The issue for nearly 2,000 years was not occupation of the Jewish people, but the existence of the Jewish people in our midst.
Perhaps the great majority of cases, or the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, when you see a virulent anti-Zionism, that there's also an anti-Semitism right behind it.
Today we need to judge contemporary geopolitical hostility towards the Jewish people in light of the long legacy of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that in many ways led to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. Because how odd is this, that we've said, you can't live in our midst, and then finally they said, okay, establish a homeland, and then we turn on them again and say, you can't live there either. History tells us this: it doesn't matter where they are, whether they're in their land or out of their land. The nations of the earth still loathe their existence.
You know, the interesting thing, as a Jewish believer in Jesus, I'm in constant conflict with my people. I'm rejected and put out and misunderstood. I'm called an apostate because of my faith in Jesus. I'm considered public enemy number one because of my, quote, missionary work. And I'm the last one to defend the Jews are just the most wonderful, special people in the whole world. We have a joke. Oh, yeah, you got a burden for Israel. You got a burden for the Jewish people. Go live in Tel Aviv for a year and see what happens to your burden. I'm a constant critic of the modern state of Israel because of any failings among my people. As a friend and a brother, I'm going to address them. For me, this has nothing to do with ethnic superiority. For me, this has nothing to do with favoritism. For me, this has nothing to do with God having two different peoples on the earth. It's a simple issue: the faithfulness of God. Can God be trusted? Does He keep His word?
We can't emphasize too much the ethical issue which is involved with the treatment of the Jewish people and the nation of Israel by the Christian church. Do you understand? This is not for academics. We're not dealing with just some little historical matter to consider and move on. No. We're dealing with that which should cause tears to come to our eyes. And we should wonder, how could the church ever do such a thing? How could it be so mean? How could it be so degrading? And the reason, of course, is you don't get bad fruit from a good tree. You don't get good fruit from a bad tree. You only get good fruit from a good tree.
In the wake of the crucifixion and resurrection of a Nazarene, Abraham's family suffered a great rift. The initial impasse between the church and the synagogue that began in the first century remains a historical continuum up to this present day. The fruit of it has never been more evident and destructive than in the days of the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler in the heart of so-called Christian Europe.
Poland was hit hardest by the Holocaust. 3.3 million Jews before the Holocaust, 300,000 after. So you're talking about 9 out of every 10 Polish Jews slaughtered.